After I became a widow, I moved the savings into another account. My son still thinks he's in charge. Have you ever given so much of yourself that you forgot you existed? You cook their meals, fold their laundry, pick up their messes, and one day they call you too forgetful to handle your own life. I used to run this household. Every bill, every detail, every holiday. Now they hand me instructions like I'm a child. They say it's for my safety. But I wasn't unsafe. I was just unseen. Until the day I walked into the bank, alone. Until the day I stopped asking and started deciding. This is the story of how I took back the keys to my life. Not with a fight, but with something sharper, clarity. If you've ever felt invisible inside your own family, stay with me. You're not alone, and you're not done yet. My name is Eunice. I'm 73 years old, and I've lived in the same small town in northern Michigan since 1974. Most people around here know me from church or the farmer's market. Some just know me as Craig's mom. And for a long time, that was fine. But something happens when your world starts shrinking, when your decisions get double-checked, your money gets reviewed, and your name starts fading behind your son's email signature. This story isn't dramatic. No one screamed. No one slammed doors. But something did break. And I think it was the illusion that love and control are the same thing. So if you're someone who's ever sat quietly while someone else explained what's best for you, I invite you to listen. Not just to what happened, but to how I came back to myself. Subscribe if this speaks to you, because no one should grow old feeling erased. That morning, the silence in the kitchen was louder than ever. For the first time in 50 years, I brewed coffee for one. I didn't realize how mechanical marriage had made my mornings. I knew which burner to click first, how many scoops of coffee grounds he liked, which cupboard he always left cracked open because he insisted the hinges were off. Every little habit was still there, lingering in the house like the scent of wood polish and winter air. I moved through the routine slowly, careful not to bump the same corner he always did when coming in with the mail. The air outside was still, no birdsong, just that kind of cold that makes every sound feel muted. I sat at the kitchen table in my robe, hands wrapped around the chipped mug he gave me on our 25th anniversary. It had a cartoon dog on it. He thought it was hilarious. I hated it for about a week, then never drank from anything else again. I didn't cry that morning. The tears had come and gone in waves after the funeral. I think I've reached the stillness that comes after a long storm. Not peace, just quiet. Loretta knocked on the back door like she always did. 2 short taps, 1 long. She never used the front. Said it felt too formal, like she was visiting a stranger. I opened the door before she could finish the pattern. "Morning," she said, her breath visible in the cold. She held 2 paper cups from Edna's. "Got yours with just a splash of cream." I remembered. I nodded and stepped aside. Loretta had a way of entering quietly, like she was stepping into a memory instead of a house. We sat in silence for a bit, the kind of silence that doesn't demand anything. She set the cups on the table and folded her gloves into her coat pocket. "Do you sleep at all?" she asked eventually. "Enough," I lied. She didn't press. Just took a sip of coffee and stared out the window like she was expecting the snow to tell her something. "The place looks the same," she said. "You haven't moved anything." I didn't see the point. She glanced at the envelope of sympathy cards on the counter. "You gonna open those?" I shook my head. A long pause. "Not today," I added. She reached for her cup again, tapped the rim lightly. "Have you thought about the accounts yet? You know, now that it's just you?" I looked down at my coffee. The swirl of cream had settled into a pale cloud. haven't touched any of that, I said. Still in both our names. Loretta leaned back in her chair, arms crossed. Honey, I don't mean to sound harsh, but if you don't hold the keys, someone else will lock the door on you. That was Loretta's way. She never dressed her advice in soft fabric. She delivered it like a quilt with no batting, rough but warm. I don't know where to start, I admitted. I never handled the banking, never had to. You're not helpless, Eunice. You've just never been invited to the table. The house creaked as the heat kicked in. I hadn't realized how cold I was until that moment. Loretta finished her coffee and stood. Well, I'm headed to the market. I need eggs. Do you want anything? No, I'm good. Call me if you change your mind. About the eggs or the accounts. I walked her to the door, watched her steps fade into the white sidewalk, coat flapping gently in the wind. The moment she turned the corner, I closed the door and stood still in the foyer. Something inside me moved. Something I hadn't felt in years. Not anger, not grief, just a dull flicker of self. That evening, while washing the last dish from dinner, I remembered the bottom drawer of the file cabinet, the one with the rubber band around the handle. He'd always told me, "That's just the boring stuff. No need for you to mess with it." After I dried my hands, I walked into the spare room, knelt on the old carpet, and pulled open the drawer. It creaked like it hadn't been opened in a decade. Inside, old checkbooks, insurance policies, joint accounts, mortgage papers, folders labeled with dates and clipped receipts, every bit of our life together, alphabetized and forgotten. I sat on the floor for a long time, the cold seeping through my slippers. I wasn't sure what I was looking for. Maybe proof that I hadn't imagined it all. The trust, the structure, the belief that someone else always knew best. I hadn't looked at those papers in years, but that night, I laid them all out on the table. I didn't know where to begin, so I started with the account statements. There were paper trails going back 25 years, each month carefully printed, each transaction noted. He always liked to keep things tidy. Not for me, not to share, just tidy for the sake of it. My name was there, printed right beside his, but I had no memory of ever signing those forms. I suppose I must have. At some point in our early days, before Craig was even born, when we still believed life would be simple and predictable, he filled out the papers, told me where to sign, and I signed. Most of the balances hadn't changed in years. Money just sat there. No withdrawals, no transfers, just quiet accumulation, as if he'd prepared for something but never told me what. Retirement, emergencies, the unknown. Maybe he thought dying first was his last act of responsibility. There was something strangely comforting in those numbers, familiar, steady, but now they felt like secrets he never meant to keep. I stacked the papers by type, checking, savings, retirement, separate piles. I made a list in my notebook, the one I used for recipes and reminders. It felt strange writing Bank of Pine River next to grocery, whole milk, and Monday, trash bins out. But I needed to see it all in one place. Something real, something mine, even if it had been his first. Halfway through sorting, I found a folder I didn't recognize. Not one of his usual ones. It was labeled Eunice Trust. I sat up straighter. I opened it slowly. Inside was a document, a trust agreement. He'd set it up 5 years ago, quietly, privately. I flipped through the pages, feeling a pulse behind my ears. It named me as the beneficiary, of course, but it also named Craig as the successor trustee. I didn't know what that meant yet, but I had a feeling I wouldn't like it. It wasn't just about money anymore. It was about control, about how much I had unknowingly surrendered over the years, about how easily someone I loved could assume I wouldn't or shouldn't be in charge of my own life. I closed the folder and rested my hand on it. I thought about Craig. Not cruel, not heartless, just certain. Certain that he was supposed to lead. Certain that I was meant to follow. That's what scared me more than anything. Not that he wanted to take over, but he thought it was already done. Later that night, I made myself a cup of tea and stood at the back window. The snow was falling again, soft and quiet, the kind that made the whole town hush. Craig had called the day before, left a voicemail. "Hey, Mom, I'll come by Sunday. We can go over everything. Bank stuff, house title, maybe talk about selling the side lot. It's probably too much for you now." He said it kindly, like he always did, like a son who thinks he's doing the right thing. I didn't call back. I remembered what Loretta had said. "You're not helpless. You've just never been invited to the table." And I realized she was right. I hadn't been invited. But maybe it was time I pulled up a chair anyway. That thought stuck with me as I cleared the table, stacked the documents, and placed the trust folder back into the drawer. This time on top, not hidden. I washed the mug with the cartoon dog, dried it carefully, and placed it back in the cabinet facing forward. I hadn't looked at those papers in years, but that night, I laid them all out on the table. I sat there a long time after the table was covered in paper. It was a strange thing, looking at the architecture of a life. Not the people, not the photographs, not the memories, but the infrastructure. The ledgers, the numbers, the notations written in margins, the little reminders he left himself. Transfer $200 for propane. Don't forget the December CD. He'd written in blue ink, always in all caps. I used to tease him for that. Said it looked like he was shouting at the bank. He'd grin and say, "Well, sometimes you have to." Now the handwriting felt like a fingerprint pressed into every sheet. It was oddly tender, strangely intimate. I traced one of the notes with my finger and wondered if he ever imagined I'd be reading them alone. The furnace kicked on again. That old rattle. The same one that drove him nuts every winter and he never got around to fixing. I thought of the hundreds of things like that. Tiny chores, unfinished, unnoticed, yet somehow holding up the rhythm of our days. I got up and turned on the radio. Static. Then the familiar voice of the late-night host from the AM station out of Allentown. He was talking about snowfall levels and how early the river was freezing this year. I let him talk, just for the comfort of another voice in the room. I wasn't ready for quiet again. There was still so much I didn't know. About accounts, about legal forms, about what any of it meant. But I didn't feel afraid, just unfinished. Like I'd walked into a room that had been locked for years, and now I was finally flicking on the lights. I folded the papers neatly, grouping them by type, then put them back in their folders. I wrote myself a short list. Learn what trustee means. Call Loretta. Refill coffee filters. I wasn't making a plan yet, but I was preparing to. That mattered. Craig brought his laptop over like it was a briefcase full of solutions. All I brought was banana bread. He called it a check-in visit, like I was a client and he was managing something official. Tina was with him, of course. She always came when he asked, but I never quite knew if she wanted to. Her coat was still buttoned when she sat down on the edge of the couch. I had set out plates and napkins, made coffee just the way they liked it. His black, hers with a teaspoon of sugar. The banana bread was a little overbaked on the edges, but it was still warm. I didn't offer advice or ask questions. I just placed the plate between them and said, "Still your favorite, right?" Craig didn't touch it. He had already opened his laptop before he'd even unzipped his coat. The screen cast a cold blue glow over the living room. The gas heater ticked behind us, trying its best to keep the cold out. So, he said, fingers tapping the trackpad. I put together a rough plan. Nothing complicated. Just some basics to get ahead of everything. His voice had that steady cadence people use in meetings when they think they're the smartest in the room. I nodded. Just once. I'd learned from years of church committees and bake sale planning that sometimes the best way to manage a conversation is to say as little as possible. He clicked through colorful pie charts and tables. This is what I project for the next 12 months. Fixed costs, property taxes, utilities. We're looking at a pretty consistent expense pattern. We are? I asked gently. Well, yeah, of course. I mean, you and I. It's your budget, but I figured I'd oversee it so you don't have to stress. He meant well, or at least, he thought he did. I could hear Loretta's voice in the back of my head. If you don't hold the keys, Craig went on, talking about consolidating the two checking accounts into one, said it would make it easier for us to track things. I wasn't sure when the shift happened, from me to us, but it was there, woven into his words, soft and assuming. Tina finally took a piece of banana bread, broke off a corner, and placed it back on her napkin. Her eyes stayed on the rug. She didn't say anything, didn't meet mine. That told me more than any word could have. Craig clicked again. I've also looked into transferring some of the savings into a low-risk investment, just something to keep it growing while it sits. Right now, inflation's basically eating it alive. That sounds efficient, I said, sipping my coffee. He looked pleased. Exactly. That's the point. We just need to simplify. I think I'll have you sign a few forms. Nothing urgent, but I can bring them next week. I smiled and reached for another slice of banana bread. You've really thought it through. He leaned back like a man who'd closed a deal. It's what Dad would have done. I nodded again, this time slower. After a few more clicks, he closed the laptop with a satisfied thump. That's all for now. I'll send you a summary by email. Oh, and I created a shared folder, so we can both track changes. Tina stood before he did. She brushed crumbs off her skirt, still not looking up. Thank you for the bread, she said quietly. I walked them to the door, hugged her a second longer than usual. She let me. Craig patted my shoulder like I was a pet, like I should be grateful. We're a good team, Ma. I didn't say anything. When the door shut behind them, I stood in the foyer holding the empty coffee cup. The heater kicked on again, and the house creaked. That old wood sound that always felt like home, and suddenly didn't. I washed the mugs and set them back in the cabinet. Everything went where it always had. The left side for coffee, the right side for tea. It's funny what habits stay even when the people don't. I stood at the kitchen sink a while longer than I needed to. The water had gone lukewarm, but I didn't mind. The weight of Craig's words lingered, not because they were cruel, but because they were so confidently delivered, like the way a man might speak to someone standing in a hole, offering a ladder he built without asking if she wanted to climb out in the first place. It wasn't new. Not really. That tone, that certainty, it had just never bothered me before. Maybe it was Loretta's voice in my head again. Maybe it was the drawer full of papers I had finally dared to touch. Or maybe it was the way Tina's eyes stayed fixed on the floor, as if she too recognized the pattern but didn't know how, or didn't dare, to break it. I dried my hands and walked back to the living room. The couch cushions still held their weight. His laptop had left a faint imprint on the coffee table, a smudge I wiped away without thinking. Then I sat down with my notebook. It was just a lined spiral, half full of recipes, birthdays I hadn't updated in years, and grocery lists I never remembered to bring. But that night, it became something else. I started writing. Not thoughts, not feelings, just facts. What I remembered. Which banks? what we used them for. The mortgage lender we'd used back in '89. The certificate of deposit he'd mentioned one winter when propane prices had gone up. The numbers were fuzzy, but the names weren't. I remembered them because I'd heard them in passing, sitting at the table while he did the taxes, or reading a notice he'd tossed in the recycling without opening. I flipped back a few pages and wrote, in capital letters, what I actually know. And then underneath, enough to begin. The pen felt good in my hand, steady. I wrote slowly, not to be careful, but to be deliberate. A call came just after 9. Loretta. I recognized the ringtone she'd made me assign to her, some jazzy ringtone that annoyed me, which of course made her love it more. I answered and sat on the edge of the bed, curling the notebook into my lap. How'd it go? She asked. Just like you'd expect, I said. Craig showed up with charts, didn't he? He had categories. Loretta laughed the way only someone who had raised 2 sons could. You okay? I am. Actually, I think I'm ready. For what? For a change. There was a pause. Then her voice softened. Listen, there's a local bank, Pine River. I worked there part-time after retirement. They've got a service for widows. Helps them manage accounts privately. Doesn't go through family. I can connect you if you want. I looked down at my notebook. At the list. In the words I had just written. Enough to begin. I think I'd like that, I said. Loretta didn't respond right away. Then, you don't have to do it all at once. Just do the first part. Call them. We talked for a few minutes more, mostly about nothing. Then she said goodnight and hung up. I stayed sitting on the bed for a while. The heater had clicked off, and the silence returned. But it didn't feel as heavy as before. I picked up my phone and opened the web browser, found the bank's website, looked for a contact form, then I closed it. I didn't want to write. I wanted to speak. I dialed the number and waited. A woman answered, bright, cheerful. Her name was Carly. I told her I was recently widowed and needed to understand what options were available for someone like me. She said she was happy to help and that Thursdays were quiet if I wanted to come in. I scheduled an appointment. Thursday, just me and the papers. After they left, I noticed the way the cushions had sunk under their weight. The room felt smaller somehow, even though it was finally quiet again. I stood there holding 2 empty mugs and watched the front door long after it had closed. Not because I was hoping they'd turn back, but because I wasn't ready to return to stillness. There was something unnerving about being spoken to so confidently about your own life, like watching someone rearrange furniture in a house they don't live in. Craig never once asked how I felt about anything he laid out on that spreadsheet. He didn't ask what I wanted. He assumed ease was my goal. That simple meant surrender. Maybe that was the part that stung. Not the numbers, not the planning, but the assumption that I had nothing left to say about it. I walked back into the living room and picked up one of the paper napkins Craig had used. A faint ring of coffee stained the edge. I threw it out. Slowly. Then I sat down, not because I was tired, but because I needed to take up space again, in my own home. The banana bread sat untouched on the plate. I cut a slice for myself and ate it slowly, not out of hunger, but out of something else, something closer to reclaiming. Years ago, when Craig was still in high school, I remembered baking that same bread after his first heartbreak. He'd come home, dropped his backpack by the door, and said nothing for hours. I left a slice in the microwave for him. No note, no lecture, just warmth. That's what mothers do. Now, he sat in the same house, a grown man, telling me where my money should go as if warmth no longer mattered, only structure. That wasn't his fault entirely. I had handed over so much for so long, not just money, responsibility, decisions, space. I let him believe he needed to steer, even when the road was mine to walk. I looked at the clock. It wasn't even noon, but the sun had already shifted. That long, slanted light you only get in cold months. It stretched across the rug and landed on the armchair where he'd sat, explaining my finances to me like I was a client. Or worse, like I was a child. I wasn't angry. I was aware. Fully, finally aware. I stood and folded the blanket on the couch, straightened the pillows, picked up his empty coffee cup and washed it again, even though it was already clean. Then I opened the window a crack, just enough to let the cold air in, just enough to clear the room. I wore my tan coat and my old boots. The more invisible I looked, the better. They were scuffed at the toe and stiff from last winter's salt, but they felt solid. I liked that. The coat still smelled faintly like the attic where I kept it. That mixture of cedar, old paper, and a little dust. I'd hung it out on the back porch for an hour the night before, just to let it breathe. It didn't matter. I wasn't trying to impress anyone. The parking lot was nearly empty when we pulled in. Loretta stayed in the car, engine humming low. She didn't say much on the drive, just let the radio play softly. Old country songs about trains and time gone by. Her hands rested on the wheel like she wasn't really holding it, more like she was giving it permission to guide itself. I sat there for a moment before going in. Checked the appointment time again on the card Carly had given me. 10 a.m., Thursday, my name in tidy print. I folded the card back into my coat pocket. Inside, the bank smelled like pine air freshener, the kind that tried a little too hard. There was a basket of red and white mints on the counter, and a pen chained to one of those little stands, clicking faintly when touched. The chairs were vinyl, the color of weak coffee. Carly came out right on time. Mid-30s, hair pulled back, blouse tucked into slacks. She smiled like someone used to offering comfort, but not sure whether it would be received. I liked her instantly. "Mrs. Winslow?" she said. "Eunice," I replied. "Just Eunice, please." She led me to a small office with a low window. There were 2 chairs, a desk, and a printer humming somewhere nearby. She asked it to act if I wanted coffee or tea. I said no. I just wanted to begin. She opened a file on her computer, clicked through a few screens, then looked at me. "I understand you're interested in opening a private account?" she asked. "I am," I said, "separate from any family involvement, just me." She blinked, then smiled politely. "Of course, that's common these days. Do you have your statements with you?" I handed her the folder I'd prepared. It wasn't fancy, just copies of the most recent account balances, a few printouts I'd made at the library, and the notes I'd scribbled into the margins the night before. She leafed through them with a little furrow in her brow, not confused, just surprised. "You're very organized." I didn't answer that. I'd never considered myself organized, just careful. There's a difference. We reviewed each account one by one. I told her what I knew, what I wasn't sure of, and what I wanted. I said it plainly, like laying out grocery items on a belt. No apologies, no explanations, just facts. She nodded after everything I said, typing quickly. When she reached the end of my notes, she paused. "Would you like to move all of these today?" "Yes," I said. "All right," she said, smiling again. "That's very doable." The transfer process took longer than I expected, but not because it was difficult. Carly was thorough. She double-checked routing numbers, verified balances, and made polite small talk while the computer loaded page after page. I nodded along, mostly watching her hands move with practiced confidence. At one point, she looked up. "Just to confirm, you're the sole authorized user on all these accounts going forward." Yes, I said. Just me. She paused again, as if that deserved more conversation. But when I didn't offer any, she didn't push. You know, she said after a moment, most folks your age who come in for this kind of thing usually bring a son or daughter, or at least ask them to review the paperwork. I didn't forget, I said. She smiled. Right, just checking. She printed a few documents for signature. The pages were warm from the machine, and the pen clicked faintly as I wrote my name in the assigned boxes. Carly turned each page with care, placing them in a neat stack when I finished. That's it, she said. You're all set. The new account is active. The transfers are in process. You'll get confirmation by mail. I nodded. Do you want a temporary debit card? She asked. No rush, I said. I'm used to cash. I just wanted things clear. They are, she said, handing me the last form. You've got a very clean setup now. We stood. I reached into the peppermint bowl on her desk and took one, just to have something in my hand. Thank you, Carly. My pleasure, she said. Really. Outside, the clouds had settled low over Pine River, the sky the color of pewter. Loretta was still waiting in the Buick, one hand on the wheel, the other wrapped around a styrofoam cup. She didn't roll down the window, just looked at me and raised her brows. I got in, peppermint still in my mouth, the paper crinkling in my pocket. Well, she asked. I did it, I said. She nodded once, like that was enough. Halfway down Main Street, she asked, Were you scared? I looked out the window as the town passed by in slow motion. The diner with its chipped awning, the gas station with flags fluttering in the wind, the pharmacy that always seemed to change ownership but never its beige sign. I was, I said. But not anymore. When I got home, the light in the kitchen had gone gray. I made tea without turning on the overheads, just a little counter lamp. Something about soft light made the quiet feel kinder. I sat with my cup, slowly unwinding the peppermint into a napkin. My phone buzzed on the table. A message from Craig. Hey, Mom, we should talk more about the land titles. Let's meet soon. He doesn't know what's changed. I sat at the kitchen table long after the tea had gone cold. Not because I had anything more to plan. I didn't. Everything that needed doing was done. The folders were back in the drawer. The papers were signed. My name alone was now enough. But even with the practical matters settled, something else had started moving inside me. Slow and unfamiliar. It wasn't a relief, not exactly. And not pride either. It was quieter than that, like a lamp that had been turned on in a far room of a house I'd forgotten I owned. I thought about the first time Craig ever filled out a check for me. I'd just come home from the hospital. He was 12. I had a cast on my leg and painkillers that made everything a little foggy. He sat with my checkbook open on his lap, tongue sticking out the corner of his mouth while he copied my handwriting, careful and small. Back then, it felt like trust. It felt like help. But help has a way of staying too long at the table. Now I was the one watching the numbers. I knew what my heating bill ran in January. I knew the tax line on my retirement statement. Maybe I couldn't talk in spreadsheets the way Craig did, but I'd learned to read between the lines. Outside, the mail truck drove past and paused at the end of the block. I watched it through the window, letting my eyes blur until the red, white, blue colors became one soft stripe. When I went to the cupboard for a new tea bag, I found myself clearing a spot. Moving tins I hadn't opened in months, rearranging shelves, throwing out the old dusty cinnamon sticks I kept for show. It wasn't about tea anymore. It was about space, about what stayed and what no longer had to. On a whim, I pulled open the bottom drawer where Craig had shoved an old accordion folder years ago, the one labeled Mom Stuff. Inside were expired warranties, instruction booklets for appliances I no longer owned, and a handwritten budget he'd made when Martin was still alive, color-coded with projected expenses, and a note in the margin. Let's simplify. I smiled without warmth. It had always been about simplifying, for him. I set the folder on the counter and opened the trash bin, then paused. Not because I had doubts, but because I realized something. Letting go of someone else's version of help doesn't have to be loud. I closed the folder again, not with hesitation, but with intent, and slipped it onto the very back shelf of the hall closet. Out of sight, out of reach, where it belonged. That night, before bed, I added one more line to my notebook. Tomorrow, clean out the top drawer in the bedroom. Not because it needed it, but because I did. Craig showed up with a folder and a plan. I already had one too, just better hidden. He walked in like he always did, wiping his feet on the mat, but never asking if it was a good time. Tina followed behind him, arms crossed, eyes darting around like she wasn't sure if she wanted to be here. I'd set the table with a plate of oatmeal cookies and a pot of tea. It wasn't a special occasion, but I'd been raised to receive guests with something warm. Even when the guests came with spreadsheets, Craig put the folder down like it was a binder of gospel truth, manila, thick with dividers. So, I've been thinking more about the land, he said, pulling out a color-coded map. You're sitting on a lot of value here, Mom, and if we act before next quarter, there's potential for some serious return. He didn't even glance at the pot roast dish in the sink, the tea kettle on the stove, the smell still lingering like it might try to soften something. I looked into a couple firms who specialize in rural parcels. They'd handle everything, clean sale, no stress. We'd retain a portion, of course, but funnel the rest into a structured trust. That way, you don't have to worry about taxes or management. I nodded slowly, like someone being walked through the benefits of a timeshare. That's a lot to take in, I said. He opened another page, showing bar charts. You don't need to worry about all the mechanics, Mom. I'd manage the logistics. Tina and I already talked about streamlining the process. I turned to Tina. She looked down at her lap. Would you like some tea? I asked, and please, she said, her voice barely more than a whisper. Craig didn't want tea. He wanted control. But I poured him a cup anyway. I sat down across from him and folded my hands. Let him keep talking. He had more charts, more projections, more words like liquidate and equity and leveraging current momentum. I let him go on. You see, he said, this isn't just about money. It's about peace of mind. For you, for us. It's about responsible planning. I nodded again, then stood up. Let me show you something, I said. I walked to the kitchen counter where the manila envelope waited, tucked neatly beside the kettle. Not hidden, just uninvited. I picked it up, held it without speaking for a moment. When I returned to the table, I placed it in front of him. He looked at it like it might contain old photos or a recipe. Something benign. What's this? He asked. Documents, I said. Updated ones. He opened the flap and pulled out the first page. Then another. I didn't speak. I watched his eyes scan the headings. Property deeds. Account changes. Everything now listed under my name only. No joint oversight. No co-signatures. He blinked. When did this happen? Last week, I said. I thought it was time I learned how to stand on my own feet again. He didn't respond right away. He set the papers down and reached for his tea, then changed his mind and folded his hands instead. Tina looked at me for the first time since arriving. Her face didn't show shock, more like something else. Curiosity, maybe, or the slow realization that something had shifted. Craig cleared his throat. I didn't realize. I thought we were working on this together. I smiled gently, not to soften the moment, but to hold it steady. I know. That's what made it easy for you to miss what was changing. He nodded slowly, lips pressed together, unsure of his next move. He tapped one finger against the folder, like he was trying to summon the right sentence. I knew that look. Martin had it too, when something didn't go the way he'd mapped out on paper. I guess I just thought, Craig began, then trailed off. He glanced at Tina, as if she might offer him a lifeline, but she didn't. Instead, she picked up her teacup, held it close to her chest, and studied me. Are you mad? Craig finally asked. No, I said, with a calmness that even surprised me. Not mad, just done waiting. For what? To be asked. That landed harder than I expected. He blinked a few times, like something stung behind his eyes. But I didn't press. I didn't need to. Silence settled around us like fog. The gas heater clicked in the background. Outside, the trees swayed against a pale winter sky, brittle branches tapping the glass with small reminders that the world went on, regardless of anyone's plans. I stood up, walked to the sink, and started rinsing out the teacups. Not in a rush, not as a dismissal. Just to keep my hands moving. Behind me, Craig exhaled. So this is... What, Mom? Are you taking over everything now? No, I said, still facing the sink. Just taking back what I gave away too easily. I turned to face him again. You meant well. I know that. But I gave up too quietly. That's on me. He opened his mouth like he might respond, but Tina spoke instead. I think it's brave, she said softly. Her voice wavered but didn't break. Doing this, it takes guts. Craig looked over at her, startled, but said nothing. The kitchen smelled of cinnamon and steam. The pot roast lingered, not strong, just enough to remind us of comfort, of effort made without reward. I dried the cups and returned them to their hooks. Craig stood, folder in hand, still unsure of how to leave this version of the room. The version where I wasn't looking to him for instructions. I thought I was helping, he said finally, quieter this time. Maybe you were, I replied, meeting his eyes. But now, so am I. After Craig and Tina left, the house went quiet in that strange way it does after a conversation leaves the air heavy. The heater kept ticking, steady as breath, and the tea had gone cold on the table. I didn't clean up right away. I stood by the counter for a while, tracing the edge of the envelope he'd left behind. Not the manila one. Mine. The one I'd handed him that told a truth he hadn't expected. There was a version of me that once would have felt guilty for doing it without telling him. That part of me still lived somewhere inside, in the folds of habits and years and maternal instinct, but it didn't run the show anymore. I sat back down and opened my small notebook. The same one I used for grocery lists, church events, notes from phone calls. On the last few pages, I'd begun writing things that mattered only to me. Not lists of chores, but choices. Reasons. Reminders that my life still had direction, even if it didn't orbit around someone else's decisions. I wrote down something Loretta once said that hadn't hit me until today. You don't have to make a scene to make a move. I'd made a move today, and it felt like enough. No fireworks, no shouting, just truth, placed gently on the table between cookies and silence. Later, as the sun slipped down behind the garage and the walls turned amber with dusk, I warmed the leftover pot roast and sat at the table alone. I didn't feel lonely. For the first time in a long while, the quiet didn't feel like absence. It felt like space, like a room I could finally stand in without shrinking. I thought about Tina more than Craig. The way she looked at me before she left. Not pity, not surprise. Something closer to respect. It had caught me off guard. Maybe she'd been waiting too, in her own way, for someone to stand up to him. Or maybe she just needed to see what quiet strength looked like when it finally stopped asking permission. I didn't know. But I knew this. When Craig walked out of this house today, he wasn't the only one carrying a plan. There's a difference between being quiet and being blind. I was never blind. The house made all its usual nighttime sounds, the heater clicking on, the hum of the fridge, a soft creak in the hallway I'd never bothered to fix. I sat up in bed, propped by 2 pillows, with my little notebook open in my lap. The lamp on my nightstand gave off a warm yellow light, the kind that made shadows soft and time feel slower. Outside, the window panes were laced with frost. It would be another cold morning. I should have pulled the heavier quilt down from the closet, but I liked the weight of the one I had. It was the same one Martin and I bought on a trip to Ashland years ago. One of those fall getaways where we didn't really talk about anything deep, just shared meals and walked antique shops like we didn't have bigger things waiting at home. I flipped back through some pages in my notebook. Most were grocery lists, thoughts I'd written while the news played low in the background. But near the middle were pieces from after Martin died, little fragments of thought I'd scribbled down in those early quiet weeks when I wasn't sure what was mine anymore. One entry caught my eye. It was dated 2 months after his funeral. Craig wants to handle the bills. He says it's easier this way. Maybe it is. Maybe I don't want to think. I remember writing that. I remember how tired I felt all the time. Back then, handing things over felt like relief. But it wasn't the first time I'd done it. Martin used to say I didn't need to work. What would be the point? He'd ask, pouring coffee and reading headlines. You'd make a couple $100 a month and miss every church event. At the time, it sounded like concern. Maybe it was. But it also closed a door I'd quietly hoped might open. There was a boutique on Main that offered me part-time hours once, just a few afternoons a week. I was excited, really excited. But Martin smiled and said, "Don't be silly. We're doing fine." I didn't argue. I just called and said thank you, but no. I folded that want into a corner of myself and kept moving. That's what you do when you're trying to be at peace in someone else's day. But silence isn't the same as peace. I see that now. I reached for the mug on my nightstand. The tea had gone lukewarm, but it still tasted of chamomile and honey, comforting in a way I didn't realize I still needed. My phone buzzed softly beside the lamp. A text from Loretta. "Still awake? I just remembered something. Call if you're up." I dialed without thinking. She picked up on the first ring. "Did I wake you?" I asked. "No," she said. "I was watching some old movie on the Hallmark Channel. You know how they are. Same plot, different town." I smiled. "Background noise." "Exactly." A pause. "Are you doing all right?" "I'm writing," I said. "About before. About the times I said yes when I meant no." "Ah," Loretta murmured. "That's a lot of years." "It is." There was a kind of hush between us, the gentle kind that doesn't need filling. Then she said, "The neighborhood council has a seat open. Not sure if you'd care, but they need someone who actually listens. Someone who doesn't think the world ends at the edge of their driveway." I blinked. "Why are you telling me?" "Because you've listened to everyone else for 50 years. Maybe it's time someone listened to you." I didn't answer right away. My fingers traced the edge of the notebook page. I'd just written. That wasn't a weakness. That was love. But love doesn't mean silence forever. Loretta didn't push. She never did. "Just think about it," she added. Good night, Eunice. Good night. I sat there a while longer, the phone back on the nightstand, the tea now cold. Then I looked out through the frosted window and said aloud, to no one in particular, maybe I would. I leaned back against the pillows and closed the notebook, letting my hands rest on top of it. My fingers were still warm from holding the mug, and the weight of the leather cover felt familiar, like something I should have held onto a long time ago. It's strange how many things we let slide, thinking they're small. One conversation here, one missed chance there, but they add up. They shape the corners of your life until you look around and realize the walls were never built for you. You just decorated them anyway. Martin wasn't a cruel man. He was just certain about everything. That certainty was comforting when I was young and unsure. It made life feel ordered, predictable, but it also left no room for my own doubt, or curiosity, or questions. I don't think he ever meant to shrink me. But that's the thing about strong personalities. They don't always realize who they're standing in front of. I remember once, early in our marriage, we went to a church potluck. I'd brought a rhubarb crumble, and everyone seemed to love it. One of the ladies from the women's circle asked me if I'd thought about doing a recipe column for the bulletin. I was flattered, giddy even. I told Martin in the car. He chuckled, said, "A recipe column? You'll have more time once the kids are grown. Let's not pile on now." Just like that, the idea was gone, and I let it go. Not because I didn't want it, but because I'd already learned what kinds of ideas got the green light. But I wasn't blind. I knew exactly what was happening, even if I didn't have the words for it then. Back then, I called it harmony. Later, I called it survival. Now, I just call it what it was. Putting myself second for so long, I forgot what first even looked like. I got up to refill my tea. The kitchen was cold, quiet. I didn't bother turning on the overhead light, just the small one over the stove. It cast a gentle glow on the counter where the day's mail still sat. I sorted through it absent-mindedly, but my thoughts stayed elsewhere. I thought of Craig and his folder, his perfect spreadsheets, and how he'd looked at me the other day, confused, like he was seeing me for the first time. Maybe he was. And Tina, poor Tina. She hadn't said much, but I could tell she was listening. The way her eyes followed me when I walked out of the room. The way she held her purse close, like it gave her something to hold on to in the silence. I know that feeling. I brought the tea back to my room and settled again under the quilt. A few more lines made it into my notebook, half thoughts more than full sentences. Maybe I stopped dreaming before I meant to. Power isn't loud. I am still here. The bedside clock ticked softly. There's a kind of courage that doesn't show up in headlines or photo albums, the kind you build slowly, quietly, over years of choosing kindness when your throat burns to scream. That's what I had. That's what I still have. And now that I've remembered it, I'm not setting it down again. I used to think that aging meant softening, that somehow, with each year, the sharp edges would dull. The fears, the regrets, the buried things, until what was left was just peace. But I see now it's not about softening. It's about sharpening into yourself. Finally, all those years, I played the part, smiled at dinner tables, packed lunches with notes, turned the other cheek when I should have raised my voice. And I told myself that's what strong women do. They hold the line. They keep things together. But maybe strong women also leave the room when it no longer fits. Maybe they rewrite the rules when no one's looking. I reached down and pulled an old photo from the drawer. It was me at 23, standing next to Martin outside a gas station on the way to the lake. He had his arm around me, and I was half smiling at something out of frame. It took me a moment to recognize myself. Not because I looked so different, though I did, but because I remembered exactly how I felt at that moment. Like a passenger, like someone waiting to be told what came next. I touched the edge of the photo. She was brave in her own way, brave enough to love, to raise a family, to make a life out of what she had. But I wished I could have told her what I know now, that she didn't have to ask permission to be whole. Outside, the wind had picked up. The branches tapped lightly against the window pane. Somewhere in the distance, I heard a car pass, its tires hushing along the wet road. I thought of Loretta's voice on the phone earlier. "They're looking for someone like you." And how easily I'd laughed it off at first. But even now, that line kept humming underneath everything. Someone like me. Someone who's seen things come and go. Someone who knows what it means to stay quiet for too long. Someone who might finally be ready to speak. I looked around my bedroom, not just as the place I ended each day, but as the space where I'd begun to return to myself. The light from the lamp was soft. My tea had gone cold again. Maybe I would say yes. Maybe I already had, in the quiet. They thought I just came to listen. Turns out, I came to speak. The chairs in Cedar Hollow's community hall were still the folding kind that pinched your legs if you sat wrong. I picked one close to the back at first. Habit more than preference. Old instincts. The kind you don't notice until you try doing something different. I was wearing my soft gray sweater, the one with the pearly buttons that Martin never liked much. Said it made me look too serious. I'd put on lipstick too. Not red. Just enough to say I hadn't faded yet. Loretta was already there when I arrived. She'd saved me a seat near the front, patting the chair beside her like a sister in church. I hesitated only a second before walking down the aisle, past a dozen casual smiles and quiet nods from people who, for years, hadn't known more about me than my banana bread and Christmas cards. They smiled the way small-town folks do when they can't decide if something's changed or if it's always been this way and they're just now noticing. The meeting opened with the usual business: streetlight repairs, lawn complaints, a bake sale that needed volunteers. The woman chairing the meeting, Linda something I think, cleared her throat and said there was still an open seat on the neighborhood council. "If anyone's interested," she added, looking around like she didn't expect any hands. I raised mine. The silence that followed was polite, not stunned. A pause long enough for people to adjust. Then Linda nodded, smiled a little. "Mrs. Rollins?" "Yes," I said. I stood. My knees were steady, my voice too. "I'd like to be considered for the seat." Somewhere behind me, a styrofoam cup squeaked in someone's grip. Linda gestured toward the front. "Would you like to say a few words?" I walked up there without a paper, without a plan, and without the tremble I used to carry when I had to speak in front of people. I just looked at the faces, some familiar, some not, and let the words find their way. "I used to think I didn't have much to offer," I began, not because anyone told me that outright, but because it's easy to think that when your work isn't the kind people put plaques on. A few heads nodded. I was a wife, a mother. I kept a home. I clipped coupons and made do. I listened a lot. To neighbors, to family, to the space between arguments. I paused, not for drama, just to breathe. "And it turns out," I said, "that a lifetime of listening adds up. It teaches you where things crack and where they hold. And maybe that counts for something." When I sat down, Loretta reached over and gave my hand a quick squeeze. She didn't say a word, and she didn't need to. The vote was a show of hands. Almost everyone raised theirs. Someone clapped first, then another. Then the room filled with the kind of gentle applause that feels less like celebration and more like agreement. Like people saying, "Yes, this makes sense. I felt it in my chest more than in my ears. Afterward, there was instant coffee in a big metal urn that tasted like burnt beans and memories. Loretta and I stood by the bulletin board, sipping slowly, watching the crowd thin. Someone had posted a flyer for a lost cat, another for a quilting class. There was a notice about pothole repairs and a yellowed announcement from last spring that no one had taken down. "I think you found your lane," Loretta said, not looking at me. "I think maybe I did," I said. And I meant it. We didn't linger. Outside, the air was sharp enough to bite. I pulled my coat tighter, fingers brushing over the keys in my pocket. Real and otherwise. The wind had picked up since we'd gone inside. Leaves rattled against the pavement like they couldn't settle. Loretta offered me a ride home, but I told her I wanted to walk a bit. Let the air work on me. She didn't argue, just nodded and said, "You know where I am." The walk back was only 10 minutes, but it took longer. My boots scuffed the sidewalk in slow rhythm. Streetlights buzzed above me, and every porch I passed seemed to hum with some small, warm domestic life. A television glow here, a dog barking there. I didn't feel outside of it. Not anymore. When I got home, the house greeted me with its usual quiet. No beeping alarms, no recorded messages blinking red. Just the familiar click of the lock, the low sigh of settling walls. I turned the lamp on in the living room, the one with the needlepoint shade Martin had always hated, and hung up my coat. The manila folder was still where I'd left it that morning, next to the teapot. I didn't touch it. I didn't need to. Everything inside was already done. The transfers, the titles, the signatures, all legal, all mine. I brewed a small pot of chamomile tea and brought it into the den, where the old recliner waited like an old friend who didn't need explanations. I sat, let the warmth of the mug soak into my palms. For the first time in months, I felt something settle inside me that wasn't fear or worry or calculation. Then the email came. My laptop made that little chime it does when something new arrives. I hadn't been expecting anything, and for a second I debated ignoring it. But old habits, the kind that check in, check up, double check, die slower than pride. It was from Craig. The subject line was simple. "Sorry." I opened it. "Mom, I've been thinking a lot. I didn't realize how much you were holding up. For all of us. I know I came in swinging, trying to help and manage things. But the truth is, I wasn't seeing you. I get it now. At least I'm starting to. You always made things look easy, and I mistook that for simple. But it's not. It never was. I'm sorry. Love, Craig." I read it twice. Not because I didn't believe it, but because some part of me needed to feel the words settle. They didn't undo anything. They didn't excuse the months, the years of decisions made around me, not with me. But they were something. And sometimes, something is enough to start again. I didn't reply right away. I closed the laptop softly, as if the silence that followed was worth keeping intact a bit longer. I let the moment be what it was. Unfinished, but real. I got up and went to the closet, pulled my coat on again. The keys were still in the pocket. I didn't jingle them. I didn't raise them like a trophy. I just walked to the door, hand wrapped around the cold metal of the knob. "He'll figure it out," I whispered into the hallway, just like I did. Then I stepped outside, into the kind of night that feels like a clean page. They say life settles down when you're older, but I've learned it doesn't settle. It shifts, quietly, sometimes painfully, but always toward truth. After all that's happened, I don't feel bitter, just clearer. I still bake on Sundays. I still keep extra creamer for when Tina visits. But now, I sit at the head of my own table, not waiting to be asked, not hoping to be heard. I make decisions, not excuses. It took me decades to understand this. Sacrifice, when constant and silent, can make people forget you have a voice, even the ones you love, especially them. If any of this feels familiar, if you've spent years putting everyone else first, just remember, you're still here. You still matter. And it's not too late to hold your own keys.